A finger bone in a cave. Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Please like and subscribe so I can tell more interesting stories. Now let's get started. I still remember the first time I heard about the Denisovans. Not in a textbook, not during some late-night conspiracy theory binge, but while sipping stale coffee in a hallway lined with filing cabinets and too many unreturned grant proposals. A colleague walked by, tossed a dusty printout onto my table, and said, "You're going to want to see this." It was a finger bone, small, incomplete, barely long enough to stir soup. But it came from a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place I'd only heard of through whispered stories among archaeologists. Denisova Cave sounded like a haunted ski resort, but trust me, there were no ski lifts, just layers upon layers of ancient dirt and mystery. And inside that cave, buried beneath centuries of debris and bat guano, someone had found this bone. Not just any bone, a bone that didn't belong to Homo sapiens, and not to a Neanderthal either. No, this was something else. At first, no one believed it. We'd gotten cocky, you know. Like we had the whole family tree mapped out. Chimpanzees, Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Neanderthals, and us, done and dusted. Maybe a few cousins swinging from the lower branches, but nothing major. Certainly not another species. But the DNA didn't lie. That tiny fossil, barely the size of a pinky tip, carried a whole genome. A different one. Distinct. An ancient whisper buried in mitochondria. Historians still debate whether the Denisovans deserve to be classified as a separate species or a subspecies of Homo sapiens. To me, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that they existed, and for the longest time, we had no idea. Which is kind of rude, honestly. They lived thousands of years alongside our ancestors, possibly even shared meals or exchanged gifts. And yet we didn't even give them a name until a few years ago. We just called them Denisovans, because, well, that's the name of the cave, which is like discovering a new planet and calling it Garage. But let's go back. The Denisova Cave is cold quiet, and so layered with time, it's like an archaeological lasagna. The site has been occupied off and on for over 280,000 years. It's seen Neanderthals, modern humans, bears, who knows, maybe even ghost stories carved into walls. And somewhere in all that dirt, someone found the bone, and then someone tested it, and then someone said, "This is weird." Weird became unprecedented. Unprecedented became potentially groundbreaking. And before long, the entire field of paleoanthropology was flipping tables and rewriting timelines. Because this wasn't just another bone. This was a message from people we never knew existed. Now, here's a bizarre fact. The Denisova finger bone was originally thought to belong to a Neanderthal girl. That's what the team assumed, based on context and well habit. But when they ran the DNA, surprise, total genetic curveball. A whole new branch on the human tree. We didn't find Eve. We found her third cousin twice removed, who everyone thought had moved to another continent and died out. We were wrong. She was here, and she wasn't alone. See that cave it kept giving? After the finger bone, they found a tooth, then another tooth, then part of a skull. And each time they ran the DNA, it told the same story, not Neanderthal, not modern human. Denisovan. We didn't know what to do with them at first, because how do you process a ghost species? A group of people who lived, loved, hunted, sang, possibly played instruments for all we know, and yet vanished so completely that they left behind nothing but traces in bone. But that's the thing about bones. They remember, even when we don't. So there I was, staring at this tiny fossil on my screen, a little overwhelmed, a little terrified, and very much aware that I was looking at someone's ancestor, someone whose name we'd never know, someone who once breathed air thick with mammoth musk and fire smoke. who might have carved bone tools or whispered stories under the stars, who left behind no cities, no monuments, just silence and sediment. And yet that silence was louder than anything we'd heard in centuries. It said, "You're not alone." It said you never were. You want to know the weirdest part? I felt seen, like the ghosts in my jeans were stretching, yawning, blinking open ancient eyes. And for the first time, we were listening. That's when I started digging deeper, not into the ground, but into the story. Because the Denisovans weren't just fossils. They were a forgotten chapter of who we are, a chapter written in bone and blood and mystery. And it all started with a finger, one tiny ancient finger, held out from the dark. Not Neanderthal, not human. So here's where things got even weirder, which, if you've ever worked with ancient bones, is saying something. After the finger bone scandal, yes, I'm calling it a scandal because it shook the entire field like someone had slapped a mammoth, another discovery rolled in. This time it was a tooth. Big, chunky, definitely prehistoric. And frankly, it looked like it belonged in the mouth of something that should be charging at you through a foggy Ice Age forest. Spoiler, it didn't belong to a bear. They tested the DNA. Again and again, the results whispered the same word, Denisovan. That's when it hit us. This wasn't a one-time fluke. This wasn't a random offshoot or a misunderstood Neanderthal with poor dental hygiene. This was a pattern, a genetic breadcrumb trail from a group of people who weren't Neanderthals, and sure as mammoth stew weren't us. They were something else entirely. So what do you do when you find someone who doesn't fit? Easy. You name them. Then you try really hard to fit them in anyway. We started poring over their DNA like ancient gossip. Mitochondrial DNA, nuclear DNA, comparisons with Neanderthals, comparisons with Homo sapiens. We poked and prodded until the data practically groaned under the weight of our curiosity. Here's what we found. Denisovans shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals, but branched off somewhere between 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. That's right. They're more like cousins than siblings. Family, sure. But the kind that brings weird food to reunions and lives in a different time zone. Historians still debate whether Denisovans were a separate species entirely or just a very distinct subspecies. Like Homo sapiens versus Homo sapiens. Idaltu, same, but different. Me, I think they were just themselves. Unique. Isn't that enough? Their DNA, though, was a mess in the best way. Some of their genetic material looked ancient, like I remember saber-toothed cats, ancient. Other parts hinted at adaptations we hadn't even considered. And there were regions, large regions, that didn't match anything. Not Neanderthal, not human, not any known ancestor. That's when we started whispering the word no one wanted to say too loudly. Hybrid. Now don't panic. This isn't some X-Men origin story. There's no superpowered Denisovan flying through the tundra shooting fire out of his eyes. But it did raise questions. Had Denisovans interbred with other archaic humans, ones we hadn't even discovered yet? Let that sink in. We were already trying to place Denisovans on the family tree, and suddenly there might be a whole other branch, possibly more than one, hiding in the dark. And what about culture? That was the next shock. See, we'd always assumed that Neanderthals were the artistic ones, carving shell jewelry, painting cave walls, the prehistoric hipsters. Homo sapiens were the toolmakers. But Denisovans, we didn't know. Until we looked closer at their cave, that's when things started to sparkle. Literally, we found a bracelet made from polished green chlorite, intricately crafted, with a bored hole so precise some researchers suggested it might have been made using a drill. A drill in the Paleolithic. Bizarre fact. The bracelet is estimated to be around 40,000 years old, and it glows under UV light. Not in a spooky, cursed object kind of way, but still, jewelry that glows in the dark. I mean, come on. These people were trendsetters. Suddenly, Denisovans weren't just shadowy figures in a genome. They were artists, engineers, possibly fashion-forward. And they had big teeth. Really big teeth. Those molars we found, they were huge. Thicker enamel, broader roots, built like they could crush bones or chew through frozen pine bark. One researcher joked that Denisovans could have flossed with mammoth hair. We laughed. Then we looked at the data again, and we stopped laughing. Because it wasn't just the teeth. It was the density of their bones, the robustness of the fragments we found, the hints in their genome that suggested they were strong, like really strong. Imagine a species that could carry an elk and still build jewelry. That's the vibe Denisovans gave off. But what really got me? They were everywhere, not just in one cave in Siberia. No, their DNA showed up in places we didn't expect. Traces in Asia, hints in Oceania, footprints in the genomes of people who had no idea they were carrying the legacy of a lost species. I sat with that for a long time, wondered what it must have felt like to meet one of them. Did they look like were their eyes different? Their voices, did they laugh? Did they know they were the middle children of history, bridging the gap between giants and dreamers? Or were they just people trying to survive, to love, to understand fire and stars and why the ground shook in spring? Maybe they never asked to be remembered. Maybe they just hoped to be understood. Traces in our blood. The weirdest part of all of this, the Denisovans didn't disappear. Not really. They're still here, just quieter, more subtle, tucked away in places most people never think to look, like your bloodstream. No, I'm not saying there's a Denisovan ghost living in your platelets. That would be dramatic even for me. But their DNA, oh, that stuff's stubborn. It lingers. It whispers through generations, especially if your roots trace back to East or Southeast Asia, or the highlands of Melanesia, or the island of Papua New Guinea. Turns out some modern humans carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. That's not a glitch. That's heritage. The first time I saw the genetic heat maps, I thought the computer was broken. The highest concentrations weren't near Siberia, where the cave was, but thousands of miles south in people who had never even heard of Denisova Cave, let alone booked a vacation there. So what does that mean? It means our ancestors didn't just pass each other on the road. They stopped. They shared. They made fire together. And sometimes they made babies. Historians still debate whether Denisovans actively coexisted with Homo sapiens in the same regions or only had brief contact during migrations. But the DNA doesn't lie. Somewhere someone met a Denisovan and said, "Hey, you're interesting. Let's mix genomes." And that wasn't a one-time thing. It happened enough that today, in the 21st century, we can still find Denisovan genes ticking away inside modern humans. Genes that help people breathe in thin air. Genes that might influence immune responses. Genes that survived everything from glaciers to globalization. Let me paint a picture. Imagine you're a Denisovan child thousands of years ago. You're watching your mother smash roots with a stone, your uncle tan a deer, hide the fire crackling behind you. You don't know what DNA is. You don't know the word extinct. But you know the wind smells different before a storm. You know that if you climb too high, it's harder to breathe. And somehow, your body knows how to survive that. Fast forward to today. A Sherpa guide leads a group up Mount Everest. His lungs expand calmly in altitudes that make the rest of us feel like goldfish in a microwave. You run his DNA, and boom, there it is. Denisovan genes, still doing their job, still keeping people alive. There's something poetic about that, don't you think? These so-called extinct people aren't just footnotes. They're co-authors of who we are. And yet we forgot them. We built whole narratives around Neanderthals' paintings, museums, terrible Halloween masks. But the Denisovans, nothing. No statues, no mythologies, no bedtime stories. Bizarre fact. There are cultures today with legends of forest people or giants who once lived in the mountains, helped build things, then vanished. Some of those legends come from regions where Denisovan DNA is strongest. Coincidence maybe, but maybe not. It makes me wonder, what else have we forgotten? What other ancestors walk in our shadows without names? We like to think of ourselves as the end of the line, the final product, Homo sapiens version 11.0. Clean, modern, enlightened. But the truth is messier. We're a mosaic, a patchwork of ancient cousins. Neanderthals gave us thicker skulls, better immune systems. Denisovans gave us lung power, endurance, who knows what else. Even older species may have dropped off traits like genetic postcards. You're not just you. You're the echo of 1,000 lives you'll never remember. And I don't know about you, but that makes me feel less alone. It's like having an ancestral group chat in your DNA. Most of them are quiet. Some drop memes in the form of genetic traits. And one stubborn great uncle keeps sending strong molar genes to everyone, whether they want them or not. But here's what really gets me. We wouldn't have found them without technology they could never imagine. They lived in caves. We used machines that read molecules. They made bracelets. We built DNA sequencers. And yet, despite all that distance, we still touch. Through time, through blood, through breath. That's the paradox of progress. The more we advance, the more we rediscover how ancient we truly are. It's humbling, really, to think you're just a modern human until you realize there's a Denisovan lung hiding in your chest, a Neanderthal wrist bone in your handshake, a whisper of some long-gone stranger staring back through your eyes. That's not just science. That's poetry. So the next time someone tells you they've traced their ancestry back 6 generations, smile politely. Then tell them you've traced yours back 40,000 years. And one of your great-great-great-grand everythings might have lived in a cave, carved a bracelet, and passed on the ability to climb mountains without gasping for air. We are not alone. We never were. We are living proof that the past is still breathing. The ghosts who built tools. There's this idea floating around that ancient humans were basically just hairy toddlers with clubs, grunting, dragging things, occasionally inventing fire when they got bored. And look, I'm not saying we didn't go through some awkward phases as a species, but every now and then the past taps you on the shoulder and whispers, "We were way cooler than you think." Denisovans, yeah, they were that whisper. So here we were, still marveling over their DNA, still stunned by how they sneakily moved into our genome without ever getting invited to the history books, and then the tools started surfacing, not in some flashy Indiana Jones way, more like someone brushed a few centimeters of soil and found evidence of an engineering mindset that had no business existing 40,000 years ago. It started with a bracelet, green chlorite, polished, carefully carved, with a tiny drilled hole so smooth and symmetrical that it raised eyebrows and voices in the lab. How do you drill something so precise without metal or electricity or YouTube tutorials? Historians still debate whether Denisovans used advanced bone tools or borrowed techniques from neighboring groups like Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. But the hole in that bracelet doesn't just raise questions, it demands respect. This wasn't "oops, I broke a rock, now it's sharp." This was deliberate, artistic, symbolic even, and it wasn't alone. They found bone needles. Let me say that again, needles. With eyes. You know, the kind you thread string through, used for stitching, sewing, clothing. Suddenly, You're not picturing wild-eyed savages with animal hides draped over them like fashion accidents. You're picturing people who cared about fit, comfort, maybe even style. Prehistoric tailors, y'all. And you want bizarre? Here's bizarre. Some of the tools found in Denisova Cave were too advanced for the timeline they were supposed to belong to. Like way too advanced. We're talking tools that would have made early Homo sapiens do a double take and go, wait, we can do that. That's when the term ghost innovations started popping up in research circles, because it looked like Denisovans were doing things no one else was doing at the time. Not just copying, creating, innovating, and then vanishing before anyone could write it down. You ever try carving a needle out of bone without snapping it? Go ahead. I'll wait. These people weren't lucky. They were skilled, patient. They knew their materials. They understood durability, structure, maybe even ergonomics. And they did it all with tools we'd now label primitive, if we weren't so busy wiping humble pie off our faces. The cave itself. Denisova Cave is a kind of time capsule. Layer upon layer of occupation, each with its own style, its own flair. Some layers have tools that suggest Neanderthal use, others modern humans. But the Denisovan layers, they stand out. There's a fingerprint of intention in those artifacts, not just survival, but thought. So who were these ghosts? How did they learn to do that? And more importantly, why? Because that's where it gets really interesting. See, humans don't just make tools. We make tools with meaning. We don't just build to live. We build to tell stories. We carve notches to count days, paint animals on walls to say we were here, braid shells into necklaces to say you matter. And the Denisovans, they were doing that too. Ornaments, pierced objects, etched bone, evidence not just of intelligence, but identity. Historians argue about whether these artifacts prove symbolic thinking in Denisovans or simply utility. I say, look at a polished bracelet glowing under UV light and tell me that's just practical. No, that's cultural. That's expression. That's ancient self-awareness. One of the more haunting pieces found wasn't even a tool. It was a piece of bone that had been shaped into a kind of flute. Crude, not tuned for a concert hall, but unmistakably designed to make sound. Did they sing? Did they gather around fires and blow through hollow bones, making music under a sky filled with more stars than we can count? That's what gets me. Not just that they existed, but that they lived. They wore, they worked, they played, and then they disappeared. Without a city, without a statue, without even a cave painting of someone doing a thumbs up. Just the tools, just the artifacts, just enough for us to wonder, what did we miss? I once sat for an hour holding a replica of one of their bone needles, just turning it over in my hand, feeling the grooves, the slight imperfections. And I realized something. I wasn't holding a tool. I was holding a conversation, a wordless message from someone who lived 40 millennia ago, who shaped that bone with patience and purpose, who used it to sow warmth into a life lived on the edge of extinction. And somehow, that message survived, not in books, not in stories, but in bone. Love. Across species lines. Let's talk about something a little awkward. You ever look at a distant cousin and think, in another time, another place? Yeah, apparently our ancestors did too. Because it turns out Homo sapiens weren't exactly picky when it came to romance. And neither were the Denisovans. We didn't just meet in passing. We mingled. We merged. We shared more than survival tips and fire-starting secrets. We shared DNA. Intimately. I know. It feels strange to picture. But remember, the ancient world wasn't divided by textbooks. There were no neat species labels or evolutionary flowcharts pinned to cave walls. There were just people. Some a little taller, a little broader maybe, with a jaw that could crush walnuts and others with smaller chins and better storytelling skills. Historians still debate whether Homo sapiens and Denisovans actively cohabited regions for long stretches or only crossed paths in brief migratory overlaps. But the genetic evidence makes one thing very clear: there were children. Lots of them. One of the most famous examples, a teenage girl found in Denisova cave. Her DNA told the story. Half Neanderthal, half Denisovan, a literal hybrid. I call her Denny. Denny is proof that these weren't isolated flings or one-time oopsies. They were families, interwoven lineages, shared hearths, maybe even shared lullabies. Though I imagine bedtime was hard when your child could inherit Neanderthal strength and Denisovan altitude lungs, kid probably bench-pressed mammoth ribs by age 5. And let's not pretend Homo sapiens were left out. Our species also got cozy with the Denisovans. That's why their genes still echo in people from regions like Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Tibet. Not as footnotes, as inheritance. We carry Denisovan traits in our blood, in our bones, even in the way our bodies adapt to challenging environments. Genes linked to fat metabolism, to immune responses, to hemoglobin efficiency in thin air. We didn't just visit their world, we joined it. We became it. You want bizarre? Get this: some researchers found Denisovan genetic material in the sperm-producing genes of modern humans. That means some of the stuff that makes us us, what keeps humanity going, was partially handed down from a group we didn't even know existed until recently. There's a poetic irony there, that we spent so long thinking we were alone when we've been carrying pieces of them inside us the whole time. Makes you wonder about love in the Pleistocene, doesn't it? What did courtship look like? Was it a shared meal? A warm pelt? A song made from a bone flute? Did a Denisovan man stare into the eyes of a Homo sapien woman and say something like, "You look like you know how to start a fire," and she blushed under the aurora? Probably not. But also maybe love, or whatever passed for it in those times, clearly transcended species lines. And that's something we rarely talk about in the evolutionary story. We focus on tools, on survival, on competition. But what about affection? Connection? The decision to stay, to raise young, to protect. These weren't just physical encounters. These were lives built together. Historians argue about whether this interbreeding was consensual or situational, whether it was strategic or accidental. We may never fully know. But the result, genetic entanglement, is undeniable. The Denisovans didn't go extinct. They expanded through us, and we're better for it. The immune traits alone may have helped our ancestors survive unfamiliar viruses and harsh climates. The altitude adaptations. Those are the reasons some people today can live and thrive where others faint just looking at the elevation signs. It wasn't just love, it was legacy. And it wasn't always easy. Blending cultures, species instincts, there were surely misunderstandings, maybe even conflicts. But somehow, they made it work. Enough to leave footprints. Fossils. Families. I once sat with a Tibetan guide while doing research at high elevation. We were gasping. He wasn't. I asked how he managed. He just smiled, tapped his chest, and said, "My people come from strong breath." Turns out he wasn't wrong. That's strength. A gift from ancestors he'd never met. Ancestors whose names he didn't know. Ancestors with bracelets and needles and giant molars. Denisovans. It's humbling to realize that the human story isn't linear. It's braided, tangled, complicated. We didn't walk a straight path from ape to astronaut. We stopped. We kissed strangers. We made babies. We learned to sew. And somehow, we became us. Not in spite of the mixing, because of it. The vanishing giants of Asia. If I told you that the Denisovans may have been giants, I wouldn't be entirely joking. Now, I don't mean fairy tale giants, stomping around with clubs and eating goats like popcorn. But the fragments we've found, especially those teeth and jawbones, suggest a people who were quite literally built differently. One jawbone in particular changed everything. It was discovered in a Tibetan cave, not even by archaeologists at first. A Buddhist monk found it and gave it to local researchers who eventually realized they were holding a relic from over 160,000 years ago. Not a Neanderthal. Not a modern human. Denisovan. And the thing was massive. The jawbone had molars the size of small cherries. Thick roots, dense bone. If that jaw was any clue to their full form, the Denisovans were stocky, powerful, and possibly taller than either Neanderthals or Homo sapiens. Imagine someone who could carry their whole camp on their back and then cook dinner for everyone using rocks and bone needles. Bizarre fact. Some of the only Denisovan DNA we've found suggests a version of a gene called EPS1, which regulates how your blood handles low oxygen levels. This particular gene helps people survive at high altitudes like the Tibetan Plateau. And here's the kicker modern Tibetans have it. Homo sapiens don't seem to have developed it on their own. They got it from Denisovans. So what were these mountain ghosts doing up there in the clouds? Living, breathing, thriving. Historians still debate whether Denisovans were primarily high-altitude dwellers or if they spread widely and adapted to many different environments. But the fossil trail suggests they weren't limited to one region. From Siberia to Tibet to Indonesia, there are whispers of them everywhere. And yet, they vanished. Not in a blaze, not in some epic final battle. They just stopped being there. One day, you had people sewing by firelight, singing into bone flutes, making jewelry out of glowing stone. The next, their tools were buried in dust. Their fires were cold. Their DNA was all that remained. No cities, no burial mounds, just shadows in the genome. We don't know why. Climate change competition. From Homo sapiens disease. Genetic absorption. Theories abound, but no answer satisfies completely. It's like they slipped sideways out of history, and maybe that's why I find them so haunting. Neanderthals, we know how they ended, wiped out by a changing world and some bad evolutionary dice rolls. But Denisovans, they didn't go extinct in the usual sense. They dissolved into us. There's this theory still debated that their population was always small, that they never had the numbers to dominate or expand like Homo sapiens, that they were always dancing at the edge of disappearance. But I wonder if they simply chose not to grow the way we did. Maybe they didn't need empires. Maybe they didn't want to cut down forests or dig up oceans. Maybe living in the sky was enough. You know what's funny? Some of their tools, their most advanced, elegant ones, are older than the Homo sapiens tools we found in the same regions. In some layers of Denisova Cave, the sophistication goes backward. The older tools are better. The newer ones, simpler. Historians puzzle over this. Did they forget how? Did they stop caring? Did the master toolmakers die out and their knowledge fade with them? Or was it something more human? A shift in priorities, a change in focus. Maybe when Homo sapiens showed up noisier, busier, hungrier, the Denisovans pulled back, moved higher, hid deeper. And when they saw what we were becoming, maybe they decided not to compete. Maybe they looked at the horizon and said, "This isn't our world anymore," and walked away. Sometimes I think about that, about a Denisovan mother watching Homo sapiens arrive with their new fire-starting kits and shouting across valleys. I wonder if she took her children's hands and led them further up the mountain where the air was thin and quiet, where their genes would still find a home even if their names didn't. Because that's the legacy they left. Not monuments, but lungs. Not myths, but molecules. And maybe that's more powerful than any carved stone or forgotten king. We remember Neanderthals with cave paintings and clubs. We remember Homo sapiens with rockets and podcasts. But Denisovans, we remember them when we breathe deep in the thin air and feel nothing but strength. They vanished, but only from sight, not from us. We are still part Denisovan. There's something beautiful about knowing you're not entirely who you thought you were. Most of us go through life assuming we're made of yesterday's breakfast, a few bad habits, and whatever emotional damage middle school left behind. But it turns out we're also walking time capsules, carrying pieces of people who lived 40,000 years ago and never once posted a photo of their food. The Denisovans didn't leave behind books or statues or cities, but they left fingerprints in us. Let's start with the altitude gene, EPUS1. Sounds like a license plate, but it's basically the reason some people can run marathons at 12,000 feet, while the rest of us are wheezing after one flight of stairs. It's the superhero of hemoglobin regulation. And it didn't come from us. Homo sapiens don't have it. Neanderthals don't have it. Denisovans did. And somewhere, thousands of years ago, someone from our species fell in love, or at least in proximity with the Denisovan, and that gene began its long, invisible journey. Across generations, across mountains, into modern humans like Tibetan Highlanders and Sherpas, who now carry this little molecular badge of honor. Historians still debate whether this was a lucky accident or the result of natural selection, favoring Denisovan traits in certain environments. But whichever version you prefer, the outcome is the same part of your body's ability to adapt may come from a long-lost cousin who once lived in a cave and probably chewed louder than necessary. And it's not just lungs. We've found Denisovan DNA linked to immune system responses, to fat storage, even to skin and hair traits. It's not about being better, it's about being influenced. We're shaped by more than our parents and our Netflix algorithms. Bizarre fact. Some modern humans carry different Denisovan genes depending on which part of the world they're from. That suggests there may have been multiple Denisovan populations separated by geography, culture, or just plain stubbornness, each contributing something unique. Imagine that. Not one group of Denisovans, but several, spread out across Asia, each slightly different, each quietly reshaping the future without ever knowing it. It makes you think how many other ghost species are whispering inside us, how many more surprises are waiting in our cells, because this whole journey didn't begin with a theory. It began with a finger bone, a tiny fossil fragment lost in a cave and almost mistaken for something ordinary. And from that one piece of a girl's hand, we unraveled an entire forgotten people. I still find that astonishing, that you can hold a sliver of the past and discover a universe. And maybe that's the real lesson Denisovans offer us. That history isn't just what we find in ruins or write in textbooks. It's what we carry, quietly, every day. It's in the way we breathe, the way our blood moves, the way our children thrive in places our ancestors once feared. We are not pure-blooded anything. We are a mosaic. Bits of Neanderthal, bits of Denisovan, bits of a dozen other lineages we haven't even discovered yet, all stitched together by time, by chance, by love and firelight, and the odd, shared mammoth steak. We are more than we seem, and I don't know about you, but that makes me feel something close to awe, because for every ancestor we remember, there are 100 we've forgotten, and they still remember us. Every time we climb a mountain, every time we survive a fever, every time we wonder where our resilience comes from, they're in there, watching, whispering, waiting for us to pay attention. So maybe tonight, when things get quiet, you'll feel it. That flicker of ancient breath in your lungs, that echo of footsteps in your blood, that reminder that even extinction isn't the end. Not when legacy is written in the living. We are still part Denisovan. We always will be, so here we are at the quiet end of a long ancient trail. From a forgotten cave in Siberia to the breath of a Sherpa on a Himalayan slope, we've traced the flickers of a people once thought to be gone. Not because they built great monuments or carved their names into stone, but because they linger in places deeper than memory, in our blood, in our bones, in the genes that help us breathe. When the air thins, fight off illness, adapt, survive. The Denisovans didn't write history, they became it. They left behind no epic poems, no towering cities, but they left fingerprints on our future. They shaped our breath, our strength, maybe even our imagination. We don't know their language, their dreams, or their stories, but we carry their echoes in every step we take, and that matters. It reminds us that history is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, buried, waiting to be felt more than found. It reminds us that we are not alone, that we never were. The past isn't just behind us, it's within us. So tonight, maybe pause for a second. Think about the hands that once carved stone in the dark, the voices that sang by firelight, the strangers who became family in ways we're only now beginning to understand. The Denisovans may be gone, but their story didn't end. It's still unfolding in you and me, in the breath you're taking right now. Soft, steady, inherited. Thank you for listening to this story. Sleep well. Let the echoes rest. The ancestors are still with you, always.